I'm standing on a cliff face right now, and I shouldn't be alive. There's nothing below me but a 1,000-foot drop. Nothing above me but solid rock. And beneath my feet, it's a path that's barely 2 feet wide, carved directly into the stone, with no guardrails, no safety features, nothing. Just ancient chisel marks and a corridor of death. But here's the thing that's making my hands shake. This path wasn't carved yesterday, or 100 years ago, or even 500 years ago. Someone made this over 2,000 years ago. With hand tools, without safety equipment, without modern engineering. And when I asked the archaeologist standing next to me how they did it, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. We have absolutely no idea. This is the story of impossible paths carved into impossible places by people who refuse to accept the word impossible. Let's find out what they knew that we've forgotten. The first time I saw it, I thought it was natural. Like water erosion or some geological accident had created this narrow ledge along the cliff face. But then I looked closer. Tool marks, thousands of them, precise cuts in the granite, deliberate angles, drainage channels carved to prevent water from eroding the path. This wasn't an accident of nature. This was engineering. I was in the Yunnan Province of China, tracking down rumors of an ancient trade route that supposedly connected isolated mountain villages to the outside world. Local villagers told me stories about the Sky Road, a path their ancestors used to transport goods across terrain that should have been completely impassable. Most historians dismiss these stories as exaggerations, legends. But standing there, running my fingers along tool marks that were over 1,500 years old, I realized the legends were real, and they were more incredible than anyone had imagined. Let me back up and give you some context, because what I found isn't unique. It's part of a global pattern that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. All over the world, in places where humans shouldn't have been able to survive, let alone build infrastructure, we're finding these impossible paths. In Spain, there's El Caminito del Rey, King's Little Pathway. It's a 3-foot wide walkway pinned to a vertical cliff face 300 feet above a river gorge. It was built in the early 1900s for workers at a hydroelectric plant, and it became famous as the most dangerous walkway in the world. But here's what most people don't know. When engineers were building that modern pathway, they found evidence of an older path underneath it. Much older. Ancient Roman construction techniques. Someone had carved a route through that gorge 2,000 years before modern engineers thought it was possible. The Romans looked at a sheer cliff face and said, "We're going through here." And they did. In China, Mount Hua has the Plank Walk, a series of wooden planks bolted to a vertical cliff face over 7,000 feet above sea level. Tourists do it now for the thrill, wearing safety harnesses and helmets. But that path was originally carved by Taoist monks over 700 years ago. They didn't have harnesses. They didn't have safety regulations. They had rope, hand tools, and apparently zero fear of death. Why would anyone do this? That's the mystery archaeologists are trying to solve. Dr. Chen Wei, an archaeologist specializing in ancient infrastructure, has spent 15 years studying these cliff paths. I met him at the base of the path I discovered, and he told me something that completely changed how I understood ancient civilizations. "We think ancient people were primitive," he said. "We imagine them living simple lives, staying in valleys, avoiding danger. But that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows they were incredibly ambitious. They saw obstacles as challenges to overcome, not barriers to avoid." He pointed up at the cliff path. Someone stood here 1,500 years ago and looked at this vertical rock face. And instead of turning around, they figured out how to carve a road through it. That's not primitive. That's visionary. But vision doesn't carve rock. Tools do. Engineering does. Organization does. So how did they actually do it? This is where archaeology becomes detective work. Dr. Chen and his team studied the tool marks along the path I found. They measured the depth, the angle, the spacing. They analyzed the technique. What they discovered was sophisticated engineering that shouldn't exist in the historical period when this path was created. First, the builders used a technique called fire-quenching. They'd build fires against the rock face to heat it up, then throw cold water on it. The rapid temperature change would fracture the rock, making it easier to carve, but not randomly. They controlled the fracturing using precise fire placement and water timing. They could make the rock crack exactly where they wanted it to. Then they'd use iron chisels to carve the path, working in teams. One person would hold the chisel, another would strike it with a hammer. Hour after hour, day after day, month after month. But here's the insane part. How did they stand on the cliff while they were carving the path that didn't exist yet? Think about that paradox. You can't carve a path unless you can reach it. But you can't reach it until the path exists. So, how do you start? The answer is scaffolding, but not the kind of scaffolding we use today. Archaeologists found holes in the cliff face above the path. Precisely spaced holes drilled horizontally into the rock. These holes once held wooden beams. The ancient builders would drill these holes, insert beams, and create a temporary platform. They'd stand on that platform and carve the path below them. Then they'd drill new holes lower down, insert new beams, and continue. It was like building a ladder downward into empty space. Except the ladder was made of wooden beams sticking out of a vertical cliff, and falling meant certain death. Dr. Chen estimated that creating just 1 mile of cliff path would have taken a team of workers about 3 years. 3 years of standing on wooden planks hundreds of feet above the ground, breathing rock dust, swinging hammers, knowing that one mistake meant you'd fall to your death. Who were these people? What drove them to do this? The answer lies in understanding what these paths were used for. They weren't built for fun. They weren't tourist attractions or spiritual journeys, well, not primarily. They were trade routes. In ancient China, salt was as valuable as gold. Certain mountain regions had salt deposits, but they were landlocked, surrounded by impossible terrain. The only way to get salt out and trade goods in was to create paths where none existed. So merchants, desperate to access these valuable resources, funded the construction of cliff paths. They hired engineers, workers, and craftsmen. They invested years of labor and massive amounts of money to carve corridors through vertical rock. Because the profit from controlling a salt trade route was worth the risk. But it wasn't just about money. These paths connected isolated communities. Villages that would have been completely cut off from the world suddenly had access to trade, information, and culture. A cliff path wasn't just infrastructure. It was a lifeline. Now let me tell you about the most impossible cliff path I've ever heard of. It's in Peru, and it's part of the Incan Road System. The Incas built over 25,000 miles of roads across some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. Mountains, deserts, jungles, they paved through everything. But there's one section of Incan Road that makes engineers lose their minds. It's called the Abra Malaga Pass, and it zigzags up a nearly vertical mountain face using a series of switchbacks, so tight that modern vehicles can't navigate them. But the Incas didn't have vehicles. They had llamas and human runners called chasqui. These runners would carry messages and goods across the empire, running in relay fashion. And some of these routes went along cliff paths where one wrong step meant falling thousands of feet. The chasqui ran these paths at night. In the rain, during storms. Archaeologists found evidence that the Incas built rest houses every few miles along these impossible routes. Small stone buildings where runners could rest, eat, and prepare for the next leg of their journey. Imagine being a teenage runner, handed a message pouch, and told to run 50 miles through the mountains in the dark, along paths barely wide enough for your feet, with nothing but a torch and your training. That was their job. That was normal. When archaeologists started seriously studying these Incan cliff paths in the 1990s, they expected to find evidence of lots of accidents. Bones at the bottom of cliffs, evidence of falls and failures. But they didn't find that. What they found instead was evidence of maintenance. Regular, systematic maintenance. The Incas had teams of workers whose job was to inspect and repair the cliff paths. They'd replace worn stones, clear debris, fix drainage systems. They treated these paths like critical infrastructure because they were. Dr. Ramiro Matos, an archaeologist who spent decades studying Incan roads, made an observation that stuck with me. The Incas understood something we've forgotten. Infrastructure isn't something you build once and ignore. It's something you maintain constantly. They knew their empire depended on these paths, so they protected them like they were sacred. And maybe they were sacred. Because the Incas didn't see nature as something to conquer. They saw it as something to work with. Their paths followed natural contours when possible. They incorporated drainage to work with water flow, not against it. They weren't dominating the landscape. They were negotiating with it. Fast forward to 2019. A team of archaeologists using LIDAR technology, basically laser scanning from aircraft, made a discovery in the Amazon rainforest that nobody expected. Hidden under the jungle canopy, they found roads. Raised causeways, bridges, and cliff paths carved into formations that were completely overgrown and invisible from the ground. These weren't Incan, they were older. Built by pre-Columbian civilizations we barely know anything about. One of these paths ran along a cliff face for over 3 miles, connecting a valley settlement to a mountaintop ceremonial site. But here's what blew everyone's mind. The path wasn't just carved into the cliff. It had rest areas. Viewing platforms, places where travelers could stop, rest, and look out over the landscape. These ancient builders had created scenic overlooks on a cliff path 2,000 years before anyone would have thought to do that. They weren't just solving an engineering problem. They were creating an experience. Dr. Heiko Prumers, who led the research team, said something that gave me chills. We keep finding evidence that ancient people were more sophisticated, more thoughtful, and more capable than we give them credit for. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were building beautiful things in impossible places because they could. So let's come back to the original question, the one that started all of this. How did they do it? We know the techniques now. Fire quenching, scaffolding, chisels, teams of workers, years of labor. But that's not really what people are asking when they say, how did they do it? What they're really asking is, how did they have the courage? How did they imagine something so ambitious? How did they convince people to risk their lives for a path that didn't exist yet? And I think the answer is simpler than we want to believe. They did it because they had to. When your community needs salt to survive, you find a way to get it. When your village is isolated and dying, you find a way to connect to the world. When the only route forward is through a vertical cliff face, you figure out how to carve a path. Ancient people didn't have more courage than us, eh? They didn't have superhuman abilities. They had necessity. And necessity forced them to become incredible. There's a section of the cliff path I explored that became my favorite spot. About halfway along, there's a small carved alcove, just big enough for one person to sit down. It's not a functional part of the path, serves no structural purpose. Someone carved it as a resting spot. I sat there 1,500 years after whoever carved it, and I tried to imagine what they were thinking. Did they sit here during their lunch break? Did they look out over the valley and feel proud of what they were building? Did they ever doubt? Did they ever look down at the drop below and think, this is insane? We should stop. Probably. But they didn't stop. They kept carving. They kept building. And they left behind something that lasted longer than their civilization, longer than their language, longer than anyone's memory of their names. That's what gets me about archaeology. We find these incredible structures, and we can analyze them and measure them and understand the techniques. But we can never fully know the people who built them. We can never interview them, never hear their stories, never know what they dreamed about. All we have are the things they left behind. And sometimes, those things are paths carved into impossible cliffs, defying gravity and time, proving that humans have always been capable of extraordinary things. Here's what modern archaeologists are discovering right now. Using new technology LIDAR, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, they're finding ancient paths we never knew existed. In the Himalayas, researchers found evidence of trading routes at altitudes where modern climbers need oxygen masks. In Ethiopia, they discovered cliffside paths connecting ancient Christian monasteries that were supposedly isolated. In Mexico, they found pre-Aztec roads carved into canyon walls in areas we thought were uninhabited. Every year, we're rewriting the map of where ancient people went and what they built. And every new discovery proves the same thing. We've been underestimating ancient humans for centuries. They weren't primitive cave dwellers waiting for modern civilization to enlighten them. They were engineers, visionaries, and badasses who looked at impossible challenges and found ways to overcome them. So the next time you're facing something that seems impossible, remember this: somewhere in history, someone stood at the base of a vertical cliff with nothing but hand tools and determination, and they carved a path through solid rock. They didn't have safety equipment. They didn't have power tools. They didn't have computers or engineering degrees. They just had a goal, a plan, and the willingness to do something incredibly difficult for years until it was finished. If they could carve paths through mountains, you can handle whatever's in front of you. Because the human spirit hasn't changed in 2,000 years. We're still the same species that looks at impossible obstacles and says, "Watch this." If you want to see more stories about ancient mysteries and impossible archaeology, smash that subscribe button. We're going deep into the places where history gets weird and incredible. Drop a comment and tell me what ancient structure blows your mind. What would you risk everything to build? Thanks for watching. And remember, impossible is just a challenge that hasn't been solved yet. See you on the next adventure.